section about the nematode worm C. elegans. In real life, mental health conditions and neurological conditions can be studied in a nematode worm called C. elegans. The worm's brain may not be as complex as a human brain, but all animals evolved from a common ancestor, and so there are still some similarities. I'd like to stress that this next part is not just me treating worms like they're human. This next information is actually scientifically real and about real life. In humans, there are two chemicals called oxytocin and vasopressin, and these function as both hormones, neurotransmitters, and something called neuromodulators. They have various functions. For example, vasopressin can control how much water is in urine. They both, however, affect being social in humans. Oxytocin may seem like a hormone that might increase bonding, and it can do this between your in-group, which means your friends or people you identify with. However, it can actually make you treat other people, your out-group, worse. And just like proteins, oxytocin and vasopressin are made up of a chain of molecules called amino acids, but their chains are only 9 amino acids long, which isn't long enough to technically be called a protein. In both the hormones, the first and sixth amino acid in the chain are called cysteine, and there is a bond between the two cysteines called a disulfide bridge. In vertebrates' evolutionary history, there used to be just one of these hormones called vasotocin instead of two. However, the gene that produced the hormone got duplicated, which produced two versions of the hormone. The two versions eventually got modified and became oxytocin and vasopressin. Many vertebrates and invertebrates have different versions of these hormones. However, these other hormones can often still be 9 amino acids long, with a cysteine bond still at the first and sixth amino acid. In earthworms, the version of the hormone is anatocin. However, the worm C. elegans is a nematode worm and not an annelid worm like an earthworm is. And so in C. elegans there is nematocin instead. Nematocin evolved from the same molecule as oxytocin and vasopressin, although unlike lots of these hormones, nematocin is actually 11 amino acids long. Oxytocin plays roles in motherhood like breastfeeding and giving birth, and in C. elegans, nematocin may have a parental role as well. When C. elegans is on the same patch of food as its offspring, C. elegans may leave the food. This may allow the worm's offspring to take full advantage of the food without the parent eating the offspring's food. Nematocin may therefore ensure the offspring have more food. In humans with autism, there is a differences in oxytocin in the brain, and there can be less vasopressin and spinal fluid in both autistic humans as well as monkeys with low sociality. C. elegans has genes associated with autism in humans, and so by influencing these genes in the worm, autism can be studied. It would be interesting to study how autism genes affect nematocin in the worm. We can also talk about how, because obviously mental health conditions like depression, anxiety, the gut affects that. And one way it could do that is through gut microbiomes, like bacteria in the gut. So I might talk about how the gut affects the brain in C. elegans, the worm. So this is important for depression, anxiety in humans. So we've got the NSM neuron here. So you can see it's got 3 branches. And the nematode worm called C. elegans has a neuron called NSM neuron. And this neuron has 3 branches called neurites. One branch reaches into the gut and detects if the worm has eaten food, and food causes the 3 branches to release serotonin. The released serotonin causes the worm to slow down and turn more so that it can remain in the same area and exploit the food source. So now we're going to talk about OCD. So this first part is just in humans. So OCD is a condition where someone may obsess and feel distressing emotions about something bad happening, and then may perform a compulsion to prevent the bad thing happening. The compulsions feed back into the cycle of obsessing and then performing compulsions, which makes obsessing and performing compulsions repetitive. Although serotonin medications can treat depression or the anxiety seen in OCD, glutamate is the most common neurotransmitter in the brain and may be involved in conditions like OCD or psychosis, which is why ketamine, which affects glutamate receptors, can treat OCD but also bring about symptoms of psychosis. So now we're going to talk about OCD in worms. So in C. elegans, the worm, there is a gene called GLP-1 which affects glutamate. So C. elegans has a neuron called AVA, and normally glutamate is released onto this neuron. The glutamate is then removed from the space between neurons called a synapse, and some C. elegans have mutations in their GLP-1 gene. The mutation prevents C. elegans from properly removing glutamate from the synapse, and this means there is glutamate left over in the synapse, which causes the worm's AVA neuron to fire. So this extra activation of the neuron causes repetitive behaviours in the worm, just like an extra activation of the OCD circuit in humans causes repetitive behaviours in humans.
Part 2. In part 1 of this section, we discussed worms in real life, although part 1 is all real, and I therefore did not need to personify worms. In this next part, I talk about the science of earthworms and nematode worms to create a worm version of the fictional Disney film called Inside Out. So although the previous part was not made up, this next part contains an element of fiction as well as fact.
Inside Out is a film where each emotion is a character inside someone's head. Here's Inside Out, but with earthworms. Instead of emotions as characters, each cluster of the worm's nerves, which are called ganglia, are a character. The worm's cerebral ganglia is in green, and this is like its brain, which is a character shown here. The worm's subpharyngeal ganglia is in blue and is a character. This ganglia is like a postman relaying messages. The worm's segmental ganglia, which each control a segment of the worm, are in red. These characters are running in their worm wheels. The brain sat in a thinking pose. They had a long flowing white beard and a turtleneck sweater that had a large collar like that of earthworms. They could not watch Rick and Morty due to earthworms not having good vision. However, they loved to ponder over the vibrations the show's audio gave off. They thought very deeply about such vibrations. Air was flowing into the worm's burrow and drying out the worm. The worm needed to find something to clog up the burrow and therefore prevent the draft. The worm found a leaf. The brain said, "To pick up a leaf or not to pick up a leaf? That is the question, is it not?" The postman ganglia asked to help and asked for messages to give the other segments ganglia. The brain replied, "My dear boy, you are but a mere thread in the tapestry of life, a single drop of water in the symphony of ripples. You are as much use to me as a photograph to worms who cannot see such things. I shall pick up the leaf unaided. This type of leaf is new to me. Such novelties lead a breath of fresh air into our lives, a type of fresh air that does not warrant covering the burrows of our minds. Alas, though, a different type of leaf is no match for my superior intellect, for regardless of what leaf they are, I drag them by their pointed tip and not their stalk. No matter how pointed a leaf is, my intellect is always sharper. I control the front tip of the worm. The worm's apex is under my jurisdiction. It only seems fair that the pinnacle of the worm, its brain, should control the pinnacle region of the worm. I shall drag the leaf with the tongue like
prostomium. I must bear the burden of this task, as no one else can match my sophistication and skill of manipulating the leaves.
The postman Ganglia said, "My lord, how are we going to get the leaf back to the burrow? You need to give me instructions to give each body segment's ganglia, so I can help coordinate the worm's movements." The brain responded with, "I was appointed at this task, and this task is therefore mine, and mine alone." The postman Ganglia replied with, "Yes, but I have received messages from each body segment's ganglia, saying the worm is drying out. We need to take the leaf back to the burrow quickly." The brain replied with, "All in good time, my servants. The worm had to move. They were open to predators, and they were drying out." "All right," said the worm's brain. "I shall give you the instructions. Please try not to taint my vision of how this task should be carried out." "Thank you, my lord," said the postman Ganglia. The postman gave the instructions to move back to the burrow to each of the segment's ganglia. The segmental ganglia ran in their little worm wheels, and each segmental ganglia controlled one segment of the worm. With the help of the postman, the worm was able to coordinate its movement. The worm clogged up the burrow with the leaf, and the brain said, "Maybe I've been too harsh on you. In the words of the great philosopher, that is myself, teamwork makes the dream work." Non-fiction, nematode worms are different to earthworms. The nematode worm called C. elegans has a neuron called NSM neuron. This neuron has 3 branches called neurites. One branch reaches into the gut and detects if the worm has eaten food. Food causes the other branches to release serotonin. The released serotonin causes the worm to slow down and turn more so that it can remain in the same area and exploit the food source. The earthworm's cerebral ganglia spoke.
"I am superior to nematode worms. They only have 302 neurons. I can therefore do whatever I want with them. It is my divine right."
The postman Ganglia replied, "What if there was a creature intellectually superior to you? Could they do what they want with you?"
"There is nothing superior to myself. I watch Rick and Morty."
Meanwhile, in the nematode worm, the serotonin NSM neuron sang joyfully,
"La la 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 la. Food is abundant. Life is so great. Nothing could ever go wrong. Let's just have fun and not care about our problems. There is nothing to fear. Nothing can go wrong. Life is bountiful."
The food source ran out, though. It was a different neuron, the DVB neuron's job to make the nematode worm have a stress response. The nematode worm was a mutant. They had a modified gene that is associated with autism in humans. Their real DVB neuron was therefore altered because of the worm's genetics, and they couldn't respond to stress properly. The nematode worm loitered in the soil, not hyperactive enough to reach a new food source. The serotonin NSM neuron still sang,
"La la 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 la, life's great."
They were delusional. They couldn't accept that things weren't right. "Nothing bad happens," they said gleefully. They had loitered too long, though. Earthworms can eat tiny creatures in the soil, whether they mean to or not. The earthworm ate the nematode worm. The earthworm's cerebral ganglia still thought nematodes were small and insignificant, and that they could do whatever they want with them. Bits of grit like grains of rock in the earthworm's gut rushed to give the nematode a hug, to grind up the food. But the grains didn't understand. They were being too rough. The grains liked grinding up on things and got a real inappropriate thrill. Then, the vibrations of a huge creature such as that of a mole reverberated through the soil.
So something bigger than myself,
thought the cerebral ganglia.
"We need to get away now."
The earthworm threw up the soil it had eaten, along with the nematode worm. The earthworm was now lighter and could get away. The cerebral ganglia spoke.
I guess there was a creature greater than myself. The fact that I thought I was above everything and on top hindered me from understanding the lower creature's perspectives. When I realized this, that's when I agreed to throw up the nematode worm.
The nematode's serotonin neuron said,
Well, I guess I've learned things can always still go wrong, no matter how good you're feeling. How good or bad the world in reality is, not dictated by your mood, it just feels that way.
The grains thought the nematode excited the stomach and left us. They mustn't have enjoyed our grinding. We've learned not to grind on things without their permission. The grains exited the worm through the worm's poop. They left their grinding ways behind. In the end, the nematode worm would find a food source. I can only speculate that it was bacteria growing on the tomato on a discarded pizza, half buried in the soil. The nematode worm, being autistic, thought, it better be a plain margarita pizza. Obviously, this story has to be scientifically accurate, so if the pizza wasn't plain and contained too many spices, the spices may limit bacteria growth. Nematodes eat bacteria, and that's why margarita is a good choice, because it may contain more bacteria. The earthworm's brain spoke.
I thought I was special. I thought the world revolved around me. I was one of the chosen people imbued with value and purpose. But really I'm just a speck in the grand scheme of things. My life is meaningless.
The worm descended into nihilism. They became very depressed. It was summer, but the bright sunlight dried them out, and the ground was dry, hard and callous. The worm never came to the surface much, and became isolated, deepening their summertime seasonal affective disorder. They sat in a depressed posture, with their shoulders hunched over, and their head held down. They thought,
burrow entrances should be clogged, but this feels empty. Worms drag some leaves by the leaf's pointed tip, but I don't see any point to dragging the leaf.
Everything was pointless and meaningless to them. They thought,
I don't want to feel emotions anymore. They make me feel weak. I want a strong body that can endure the harsh reality of the world and everything it throws at me.
Scientists were experimenting with earthworms. They put the worm's nervous system in a cold, mechanical vessel, one where emotions were inhibited. Their brain and nervous system were visible at the tip of the worm. A cyberworm, like Cybermen from Doctor Who. The worm's brain could finally feel strong. They felt superior, ready to upgrade the other worms. Their dream had came true, but they were unable to feel happiness ever after. They had fallen back into their selfish need to feel superior and special.